Imagine a quiet, cozy restaurant on the outskirts of town where people come for a slice of peace, but one day that peace is shattered. A black waitress, a girl who works herself to exhaustion every day to make ends meet, suddenly found herself the object of hatred and humiliation just because of the color of her skin. Right in the middle of the room, in front of all the guests, she was bombarded with a torrent of humiliation from a police officers who should be protecting, not humiliating. Fear, pain, and humiliation all mingled in her eyes, but she steadfastly endured. Even though the world seemed to have collapsed, her brothers saw it all, and they decided that justice must be done. But before we continue this story, we want to get to know you better. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you are from. It really matters to us. You are our support, our strength, and our meaning. We are grateful to each of you who watched this video, who helped our channel grow and spread important stories. Every comment you make, every like is what drives us forward. You are incredibly important to us. We appreciate it more than you can imagine. Thank you for being with us. In a small town, there was a cozy restaurant at the edge of a busy neighborhood. Every night, people with all kinds of stories, hopes, and concerns flocked here. It had a warm, family atmosphere, and many residents loved it, knowing they could find a piece of peace and quiet here. For those who were tired from a hard day, this restaurant was something of a refuge. The bright lights outside, the aroma of fresh bread, and the quiet jazz coming from the speakers helped them forget about the rest of the world. But that night, the peaceful mood of the place was disturbed by a shadow of uneasiness that lingered around one of the waitresses, a black girl named Mia, who was here as part of the team, as the soul of the place. For many regulars, she had long been the face of the restaurant. Her good-natured smile and the sincerity with which she greeted everyone had won many hearts. But today her bright face was serious, and her dark eyes were troubled and seemingly sad. She had long ago gotten used to the complexities of her job, frequent shifts, long hours on her feet, fastidious guests, but today everything seemed especially difficult. One guest in particular stood out against this background, a tall man in a police uniform. He entered, casting a self-assured glance around as if the place belonged to him. From the looks that others threw at him, Mia realized that everyone knew him. This cop was well known in the neighborhood, and not in a good way. A reputation for sharp looks and a harsh temper had long followed him, but his position and badge made him feel untouchable. He was known for his aggression, especially toward the city's black residents. Over the years, he received many complaints, ranging from petty insults to outright abuse. But each time he got away with it, the system was on his side. For Mia and many others, this policeman embodied more than just individual animosity. It was the embodiment of the injustice they faced at every turn. He sat her down at the table, looking around leisurely, clearly assessing the people in the room, as if measuring their worth by some invisible criteria. When Mia, holding back her excitement, went to take her order, he gave her a piercing stare that sent shivers down her spine. His eyes seemed to have anger and contempt in them that he was eager to unleash. Subscribe to Deeple Pro to edit this document. Visit www.deeple.com/Pro for more information. I've been waiting about 10 minutes for you to decide to come over, he said sarcastically, pretending not to notice her greeting. His tone was icy, cold, as if he were treating an object rather than a person. Mia inwardly braced herself, knowing full well that he was trying to humiliate her. But even she couldn't foresee how far this evening would go. She only nodded and pretended not to mind the rudeness of asking for his order. But the policeman didn't back down, as if he enjoyed watching her face pale slightly and her hands begin to tremble slightly. You're probably used to quick service. Only today you decided to make an exception. Or what? He spoke louder, drawing the attention of the other guests. Mia felt everyone's eyes sliding to them, and not wanting to attract more attention, she quickly replied that she would try to bring the order as quickly as possible. But instead of calming down, the policeman only intensified his attack. As if he was deliberately trying to make her work impossible, he bombarded her with caustic comments, accusing her of slowness and incompetence, and then began to openly turn to personal insults, mentioning her appearance and even her place of origin. Every word he said was a blow, and Mia struggled not to show how hurt she was by his aggression, she felt vulnerable and helpless, like a trapped animal. Mia grew up in this city from a very young age, and from childhood her world was surrounded not only by care and love, but also by the shadow cast by prejudice and injustice. She and her family knew what it meant to be different in this city where every dream, every opportunity had to be fought twice as hard for. But Mia always believed she could overcome it and become something more. Working as a waitress was a temporary stepping stone. She dreamed of a future where she could become independent, raise money for her studies, and help her family to get out of the vicious circle. Her family was everything to her, especially her brothers. As the oldest of the children, Mia felt responsible for them and always tried to lead by example, even if it meant taking on more work or hiding her pain behind a polite smile. She knew her brothers looked up to her with respect and pride, and she didn't want to ruin their image of her as the big sister they could always count on. But every day at work was a test of strength. The guests who looked at her through their fingers, as if her presence here was a temporary accident, as if she didn't deserve to work in such a decent place. But her boss was a kind man and appreciated her efforts, so she tried to ignore the disdainful looks, do her job, and not complain about anything. But tonight turned out to be completely different. This policeman didn't just ignore her efforts. It was as if he enjoyed every moment that it could belittle her. With every remark he made, something inside her clenched, but she kept at it. Though her heart pounded harder with each step toward his desk, she held the tray with trembling hands, and when she placed his drink in front of him, he said with barely concealed contempt, "You probably think you're doing a good job, don't you? You think you have any chance of having a normal life?" His words, spoken so casually and exhilaratingly loudly, seemed to echo throughout the room. The guests, who had pretended not to notice the situation, involuntarily began to pay attention to what was happening. Mia felt her face flush with heat, a mixture of shame, anger, and resentment. Her studies, her dreams for a better future, her hopes, all of this had become the target of his humiliation in an instant, as if her value as a human being could be reduced to mere words spoken with disdain. "Look, I didn't come here to watch you chill," he said, pushing the tray away so sharply that the glass nearly fell and spilled its contents onto the table. "Or is your job not as important as you think it is? Maybe you should look for your place somewhere else, maybe on the street, somewhere, if that's all you're capable of." For a moment, the hall frowned. All eyes were on Mia. Unable to cope with the pain and humiliation, turned away, trying to stop her hands from trembling. Her restrained smile finally faded. She felt not just humiliated, but broken, and none of the patience and restraint she had been taught could save her from this pain. It seemed to her that all her hard work, her strength, and her dreams had been trampled on by one man who looked upon her not as a person but as something inferior. At that moment she was reminded of her mother's words, who had always told her, "You are strong, you have to be better than them, you have to show them that you are worth much more than they can imagine." But today those words were helpless against the pain that tore at her soul. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she held on, the pain and injustice of her current situation seemed unbearable. However, she knew that her brothers were around. They often stopped by to support her as best they could, to let her know that she was not alone. She didn't see them in the hall, but she knew they must have felt her pain. And while they always respected her request to stay out of conflicts, she couldn't help but feel the strength of their protection around her. This policeman wasn't just humiliating her as a human being, he was trampling her dignity, her dreams, everything she'd fought for, right in front of her eyes, using his power and confidence and impunity. And though she tried to maintain her dignity, something inside her was cracking at the seams, as if under tremendous pressure. She lowered her gaze and quickly headed for the counter, feeling like she had to pull herself together even though her heart was breaking into pieces. Her brothers hadn't seen what had happened yet, but she knew that if they found out exactly what this man had said and done, they wouldn't be able to stay away. The evening seemed to be strangely silent when he appeared, tall, with a hard, unfriendly face, as if carved from stone. The policeman walked slowly to his desk, casting indifferent glances around. To most of the visitors, his appearance was an alarming sign, for many knew of his reputation. He was known as someone who used force not for the sake of the law, but to show his superiority, especially against the black residents of the city. Some even preferred to leave the restaurant when they spotted him to avoid possible trouble. He stopped his gaze on Mia, who was just clearing the empty plates from the table next to him. There was nothing in his gaze but cold, impassive contempt, as if he were not a person, but a piece of furniture. She felt that gaze before she even saw him. It was creeping in like a cold wind, penetrating her to the bone. She quickly lowered her eyes, not wanting to attract attention, and continued her work, though every step she took toward his desk felt like a heavy thump in her chest. As she approached his desk, he looked at her with disdain and gritted his teeth. "What? Are you working long hours today? You think if you smile, someone will appreciate it? You think anyone here really respects you?" The words were spoken quietly, almost in a whisper, but there was such hatred and sarcasm in them that a shiver ran down Mia's spine. She was used to unpleasant looks, to innuendo, to the humiliation she had to endure for the sake of her job, but this aggression, coming from a man in authority, was much deeper and more painful. Her father, who worked all his life at the local car service center, taught her to never engage in conflict, to always be above any aggression. He told her that she would have to be strong, that she had to be able to hold her own, because sometimes the best way to fight injustice was to simply live with dignity. But now, standing in front of this policeman who looked at her like she was nothing, she felt that none of her father's admonitions could save her from this offense. The policeman went on, making no secret of his pleasure. "You know, I don't like the way you're holding the tray. I guess they didn't teach you how to do a good job." Oh, yeah, in your circle, I guess it's considered a good job. College dreams. Meaningless dreams. You're not gonna get very far anyway. His words sounded as if he wanted to erase her from this world with his tone alone. He sipped his drink slowly, with a look of absolute power and complete confidence that no one would dare to stop him. Mia knew that this man wasn't here by accident. He had come here, knowing he would meet her, knowing he would have the opportunity to humiliate her, because he liked to do it, liked to remind her that despite her best efforts, the world remained cold and cruel. The few people in the room who had witnessed his attacks exchanged worried glances, but no one intervened. Too many people were afraid of him, knew that one call from him could turn into trouble, and no one wanted to take any chances. It seemed that the walls of the restaurant, which had once been a shelter, were now a stone trap that shrank around her. Mia tried hard not to show the tears that came to her eyes. She knew he was looking for this, looking for a crack in her mask, wanting her to break, to prove to himself and others that he was stronger. He didn't respect her and never intended to. He only saw her as the other, someone he didn't think deserved even the little job she had. As she walked away from his desk, feeling that if she stayed a second longer she wouldn't be able to contain her emotions, he threw loudly in her wake, "Take your time. People like you always get back to where you belong, and no matter how hard you try, you can't change what you are." His words stung like a red-hot knife. She lowered her head and walked past the other tables, trying not to meet people's eyes. All she wanted to do was run away from those words, from that look, from the sharp sense of humiliation that gripped her. But she knew she had no choice but to go back to work, to continue serving the guests as if nothing had happened, as if her pain didn't matter. She thought of her brothers, who had been her support since she was a little girl. Mia had always told them that her job was her responsibility, that she didn't need their protection, that she could handle it. But today, for the first time in a long time, she felt how much she needed their support. Even though her brothers weren't around at this moment, she knew they would be here soon, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she wanted them to know what had happened. Mia returned to the counter, trying to pull herself together and not give away her excitement. Her breathing was rapid, and her heart was beating so hard that it seemed to hum throughout the room. The policeman was in no hurry to calm down and, as if teasing her from afar, kept throwing caustic glances in her direction. He waited for her to return to his table and seemed to savor the moment when she would approach again to be at his mercy. She knew what would happen next. She'd seen this sort of thing all too often. This man would go on until he was sure he had finally humiliated her, until she lost her temper. But she knew she couldn't afford it. Mia was used to holding back, used to wearing a mask of politeness, even when her insides clenched with pain and resentment. She took a deep breath, picked up a new tray and headed for his table. Every step of the way, she felt the stares of the other patrons, some with concern, some with sympathy, and some with complete indifference, as if they didn't care at all. The stares were unbearable to her, but Mia didn't let herself slow down. She forced herself to walk, though with each step her confidence seemed to diminish. As she approached the desk, the policeman met her with a smug grin that held nothing but contempt. "Oh, finally," he said with faint surprise, turning his gaze back to her. "I thought you'd never decide to come back. How do you like your job? Do you think it's what you're capable? How far do you think you'll go with it?" He threw those questions at her, as if he were mocking her in front of everyone. Every word he said was like poison to her soul, a sense of humiliation that made her throat tighten. Mia knew she shouldn't respond, knew the best way to handle it was to just ignore him, but his words burned her like red-hot iron. "What? Pride won't let you answer?" His voice grew louder, attracting the attention of the other visitors. "Maybe you think you're better than the rest of us, that you're special." His voice cut through the silence, leaving a trace of humiliation and pain. The people around him, even those who realized that something terrible was happening, continued to sit in silence, afraid to intervene. Everyone knew who the policeman was, and no one had any desire to ruin their relationship with the law for the sake of a waitress whom many didn't even know by name. In this silence lay the profound tragedy of her situation. One person allowing herself to behave like this, knowing that no one would stand up for her. Pain flared inside her, bitter resentment mixed with a deep sense of helplessness. She felt like she was suffocating under his onslaught, like she was caught in an invisible trap from which there was no escape. Mia realized she couldn't defend herself, couldn't get out of this situation without destroying everything she tried to build. The policeman leaned forward, moving closer, his voice quieter now, but with even more hatred. "You know, in my world, you're not even worth my attention. People like you never amount to much. You're just dirt underfoot, easy to sweep away." The words were like a spit in her soul. Mia felt tears rolling down her cheeks, but she quickly brushed them away, trying not to show weakness. Everything inside her was screaming, begging for rescue, for support, for justice, but she knew she had to stand to the end without giving away her humiliation. However, the tears she tried to hold back began to run down her face, betraying her inner feelings. She realized that she was humiliated in front of everyone, that her dignity had been trampled in front of everyone who sat her day in that hall. The policeman, seeing her tears, grinned even wider, pleased with the result. "That's all you know how to do, right? Crying when you're put in your place. That's what you're all about." His words were icy and cruel, devoid of any respect. He seemed to savor her pain, every moment of her humiliation. He saw in her tears his superiority, his power, and it only made him more certain that he was doing the right thing. He was sure that his status protected him, that his actions would go unpunished, because he was a representative of the law. Mia couldn't take his gaze any longer. She averted her eyes and sat quietly, trying to keep her voice low. "Excuse me, I'll get your order." But even her attempt to walk away, to remove herself from the situation, only fueled his anger. He grabbed her wrist, stopping her from leaving. His grip was cold and strong, a reminder that he could do anything he wanted to her, and no one would dare stop him. "Where are you going?" "I'm not finished. I haven't decided what to do with you yet," he said, with a cynical grin. That touch, his grip, was the last straw for Mia. She felt despair surge through her, the unbearable pain of humiliation that had become unbearable. In that moment, she forgot about everything, her dreams, her dignity, even her family. In that touch, in that moment, was all the injustice she had faced all her life. But something in her still resisted, a faint spark of pride and dignity that she kept deep in her. Oh, and though tears continued to roll down her cheeks, she wrenched her hand from his grip with a strength that surprised even herself. She turned and walked away quickly, heading for the service exit, knowing she couldn't stand another second of his presence. Her heart was broken and her soul crushed. She couldn't stay here knowing that she had been humiliated so openly, in front of everyone, yet no one had made a single move to protect her. But as she stepped outside and breathed in the fresh air, she felt another feeling, rage. She remembered her dreams, her brothers who always supported her parents who taught her to never give up. And in that moment, she realized that her pain would not go unnoticed. She knew that her brothers would not leave her alone in this struggle. This night she had hoped to forget was going to be the beginning of something much bigger. Outside, that evening chill burned Mia's skin, but instead of the relief she expected to feel, she was overcome with unbearable despair. Her hands were still shaking from the policeman's rough touch, and a mixture of humiliation and rage boiled inside her. She tried to regain her breath, but her heart wouldn't let up, and the tears she had held back in the hall now flowed freely, leaving hot marks on her cheeks. Through the faint streetlight, Mia saw her brothers standing on the sidewalk, waiting for her to finish her shift. They were here, as they were every week, to visit her and spend some time together. Their presence, which always brought her comfort, this time, on the contrary, only increased her pain, as if their appearance reminded her of what she wanted to avoid, that her family, her loved ones, had witnessed her humiliation. Her brothers noticed her tears at once. The eldest, Louis, was the first to rush to her, his face contorted with worry and concern when he saw her condition, his strong arms wrapped around her shoulders, as he had done so many times as a child when he had protected her from the teasing of the other children. But this time, the pain behind her tears was deeper and any taunting, and it drove him into a rage. "Mia, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" His voice was firm, but there was pain in it. He didn't want to see his sister like this, broken and humiliated. Mia tried to hide her face, wiping away her tears and pretending everything was all right. But the pain was too great, and the memory of the policeman's cruel words still echoed in her ears. She tried to speak calmly, but her voice trembled. "It's all right, Louis. Really, it's just that it said something unpleasant. I need to go back inside." But Louis realized at once that it was more than words. His eyes flashed with determination, and he said firmly, "Who was it? Mia, tell me. We can't just let this go." Her younger brother, Jaden, stood beside them, his face frowning in grim determination. He was younger, but he was used to protecting his sister. He and his brother stared at her, realizing she was hiding something truly horrible. But Mia tried to hold back, not wanting to bring them into the conflict. "It's just one of the visitors," she barely got out, trying to avoid the subject. "Don't worry, can't handle it. I have to get back. My shift isn't over yet." But Louis wasn't going to let it go. His face contorted with anger, and he said firmly, "You're not going back in there until you tell us what happened. Mia, you have to tell us what he did." Through her tears and pain, she could not help but tell them how the policeman had treated her roughly, how he had insulted and humiliated her, how his cold, cruel gaze left her no choice but to obey, how his words cut her heart. She told of how he had grabbed her wrist, how he had looked down on her as if she were nothing, as if her life, her efforts and dreams, meant nothing. With every word she said, Louis's face grew darker and darker. He clenched his fists so white his knuckles turned white, and fire burned in his eyes. He had always been protective of his family, his brothers and sister, and the thought of someone allowing themselves to do this to Mia was unbearable. He looked at his younger brother, who also seemed ready to throw himself into the fight. Their gazes read the same decision. They couldn't just let it go. Louis struggled to stay calm for his sister's sake, but his voice betrayed a simmering rage. "That man, whoever he is, has no right to treat you like that. How dare he?" Mia, still shivering, looked at her brothers and tried to reassure them. "He is a cop, Louis. If you go in there now, it could get us in a lot of trouble. There's nothing we can do. You know that." But Mia's words only strengthened the brothers' resolve. They knew very well that it was difficult to fight such people in the city, but her humiliation and tears made them unshakable. Louis hugged his sister and said firmly, "You don't have to be afraid. We're with you, and he will answer for this. We won't let him hurt you again." Jaden, who had always been taciturn and quiet, now looked firmly at his older brother. "We'll go together. This man has no right to do this." They knew they were risking a lot by confronting a man in power. In a world where people, like that policeman, could humiliate others with impunity, standing up for their sister meant risking themselves. But for them, it was unbearable to see that man break Mia, robbing her of her confidence and making her cry. It wasn't just a personal grievance, it was a manifestation of everything their family had faced all their lives: humiliation, discrimination, neglect, and hatred they didn't deserve but couldn't defend themselves against. They headed back toward the restaurant, ready to face the policeman and let him know that he could no longer humiliate Mia, that she was not alone, that she had protection. Their hearts were filled with anger and determination, and the fear they might have felt vanished before their desire to stand up for their sister's honor. That night changed them forever. When Mia saw her brothers heading back toward the restaurant with determination, her insides clenched. She knew their intentions were just, that they wanted to protect her and fight back against the man who had allowed himself to humiliate her. But she also knew that this man was a police officer, a man with power and protection in the system, and a confrontation with him could have dire consequences. Mia understood that her brothers were willing to take risks for her, but in this city, such risks often went unpunished for those who abused their power. Her mind was flooded with memories from her childhood when she and her family faced being considered outsiders. Back in school, her brothers had faced jeers and taunts from other students and even teachers who were not shy about making disparaging remarks. And those moments when she looked into her brother's eyes, she saw strength and determination in them, but also the pain they hid to protect her and the rest of the family. This pain seemed to be passed down from parents to children, and every time Mia saw it in her brother's eyes, she felt guilty for not being able to shield them from these experiences. As they entered the restaurant, their footsteps sounded like a drumbeat, and Mia felt panic overwhelm her. She wanted to yell for them to stop, but the words stuck in her throat and her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. There was still a tense silence in the hall, and as soon as her brothers came within sight of the policeman, he met them with a sneering look of cynical arrogance, as if he knew in advance that the encounter would lead nowhere good. Louis, her older brother, was the first to speak. His voice was restrained, but there was a suppressed fury in it. "We want to talk. The way you treated our sister is unacceptable." The policeman sitting at the table looked around at the brothers as if they were just trash hit, could sweep away at any time. He leaned back in his chair calmly, even with a tinge of amusement, and answered, "Your sister? Oh, yeah, the waitress who thought she could run this place. Look, man, I think she had a little too high an opinion of herself. All I did was put her in her place." His words were like a knife to the heart, and Mia felt humiliation again, but now for her brothers, who had witnessed the rudeness. Louis clenched his fists, his face stony, but he tried to hold back. He didn't want to give in to provocation, because he realized that was exactly what this man wanted. The policeman, smiling, continued, "You shouldn't get involved, kid. It's none of your business. In fact, maybe it's time you all realize where you belong in this town." These words, spoken with cold-blooded confidence, sounded like a final judgment. Policeman knew that his badge protected him, that he could say and do whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him. He looked at his brothers with undisguised contempt, and that contempt went far beyond one man. There was a certainty in his gaze that he belonged to the right side, that he was part of a system that would never let someone like them get justice. Jaden, the younger brother, for the first time couldn't help himself. His voice, full of resentment and anger, broke. "You have no right to treat her like that. You have no right to talk to people like that. You're supposed to protect people, not humiliate them." The policeman only grinned, leaning in close to Jaden so that their faces were on the same level. There wasn't a shadow of fear in his eyes, just contempt, as if he already made up his mind that they were nothing to him and that their words didn't matter. "Listen, kid," he said quietly, almost in a whisper, but so that everyone could hear. "You all better understand one simple thing. I'm the law, and you're nobody, and if you have any sense at all, you will leave now and never dare to cross me again. Otherwise, I will find a way to run you all out of this town. Do you understand?" These words penetrated the hearts of the brothers like poison. They knew that this threat was not empty words. This man could really make their lives unbearable by using his power and connections. He could harm not only them, but also their family. But in that moment, as Mia looked at her brothers standing in front of this cruel man, she realized that they could not afford to back down. She knew that if they left now, it would mean defeat not just for her, but for their entire family. for everything they had fought for. Louis took a step forward, his eyes burning with anger and determination. He realized that now they were standing on a line they might not be able to cross back. He didn't look away, even as the policeman stepped up and was a level above him. "You may think you're the law," Louis said, his voice firm and clear, "but we won't let you humiliate our sister, our family. Your power does not give you the right to deny us respect." For a moment there was a tense silence in the hall, so thick that the air seemed impenetrable. The people around, who had witnessed the scene, could not look away. Some of them looked with alarm, others with outright fear, but no one dared to support the brothers. In their eyes was the realization that they were all alone in this conflict. The policeman laughed loudly, mockingly, as if he were quite sure of his victory. He took a step back, smiling broadly, but his smile was frightening, devoid of any kindness. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and began dialing a number in full view of everyone. Slowly, as if to show his brothers that he could call for backup at any moment and make their lives a nightmare. "Well," he said, addressing everyone in the room but looking directly at Mia and her brothers, "if you're not going to leave amicably, I'll find another way to settle this. You chose this." Louis and Jaden frowned, realizing that the consequences of their confrontation might be far more serious than they had imagined. Mia, standing behind them, felt the cold fear seize her. Again, she knew that this man was willing to do anything to prove his superiority, and that in this town he could manipulate the law as he pleased. In that moment she realized that their world, their little dream of justice and the possibility of living here in peace, was crumbling like a house of cards before their eyes. There was an oppressive silence in the restaurant, broken only by the thudding sounds of Mia's heart, who was still standing behind her brothers, trying to make sense of what was happening. She was shocked, unable to believe that their quiet evening had turned into such a horror. But the worst part was that they were standing in the face of a man who epitomized the entire system of injustice they had faced all their lives. The policeman, tall and confident, held the phone in his hand defiantly, as if to remind them that one move from him and their lives could be ruined forever. He knew they had nothing to answer for, as they were strangers here, weaker and more vulnerable than he would ever be. Quiet whispers began to emerge among the diners. People exchanged anxious glances. Sensing the growing tension, they realized that they were witnessing something dark and unfair, but no one dared to intervene. For many of those present, the policeman who stood before them was more than just a man in uniform. He was a symbol of power and control that could easily change their lives for the worse if anyone dared to go against him. Mia tried desperately not to panic, but her fear was getting worse. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for someone to help, but there were only silent faces. People were sitting as if stuck to their seats, only occasionally glancing in their direction. But when they saw her eyes, they looked away. The silence was more frightening than any words, as if it told her that they were alone. But in the far corner, at one of the tables, sat a man who looked at the policeman with obvious disapproval. He was one of the regulars, a quiet man who often sat in this restaurant with a cup of coffee and a book. Today he had put the book aside and was watching intently, his face expressing concern and even some strong disagreement. The man looked older than the other guests. His face was riddled with wrinkles and his eyes seemed filled with heavy memories. Mia felt that there was something about him that set him apart from the others, as if he knew what it was to fight for justice. She looked at him desperately, her eyes pleading with him to intervene. He caught her gaze, and there was understanding in his eyes. He rose from his seat and began to walk slowly toward them, never taking his eyes off the policeman. His footsteps sounded muffled but determined, and every step he took seemed to speak of his inner strength. When he got close enough, the policeman turned around and looked at him with obvious annoyance. He clearly didn't expect anyone to dare to interface. "Mr. Brown," the policeman said with contempt in his voice, "you might want to stay out of this. You don't understand what's going on." The man, whose name was Mr. Brown, looked at him calmly and answered quietly, but with firmness in his voice, "I understand perfectly well, officer, and I see what's going on here. This restaurant is a place where people should feel safe, and you seem to have forgotten what it means to protect people." The policeman grinned, but his grin was cold, almost icy. Protect the likes of them. He nodded at Mia and her brothers dismissively. There are laws in this town, Mr. Brown, and I get to decide who they apply to and who they don't. Mr. Brown did not retreat. His face remained calm, but his eyes flashed with anger. You use your power to humiliate innocent people. I've seen enough to know that your badge is not a license to abuse and humiliate. Don't forget that your behavior will sooner or later backfire on you. The policeman frowned, his face contorted with anger. He obviously had not expected such insolence from a regular visitor, and he was not about to suffer public condemnation. He took a step forward, approaching Mr. Brown, and said with menace in his voice, "Do you think your words matter? You think you have the power to make a difference? If you take their side, you'll find yourself in a bad position too. Think twice before you get involved in someone else's problems." But Mr. Brown remained unshaken. He continued to stand straight, not backing down, showing no fear or doubt. He glanced at Mia and her brothers, as if confirming his determination to support them. The gesture was something incredible to her, because in his eyes she saw not only sympathy but respect. He saw her as someone whose rights had been violated, and he wasn't going to be silent. Then something unexpected happened. A couple of other visitors who had been sitting at neighboring tables and silently watching the conflict also got up and came closer. These were people who had never interfered in such matters before, who thought it safer for them to remain on the sidelines. But Mr. Brown's words, his determination and faith in justice, seemed to awaken in them something they had forgotten, a sense of dignity and an understanding that it was not always possible to turn a blind eye to evil. The policeman tensed as he saw people start to get up from their seats and come closer. His confidence began to fade a little, though he still tried to act as if the situation was under his control. "Do you all realize what you're doing?" His voice was louder, but not as confident. "This could end badly for all of you. I'm warning you. I'll call for reinforcements, and you'll be sorry you ever interfered." But the men did not retreat. There were only a few of them, but their looks and their restrained determination said more than any words could. They knew they had gone too far, that it might have been a risk, but their sense of justice and dignity compelled them to stand. With Mr. Brown, with Mia and her brothers, the policeman felt himself losing control for the first time. This restaurant, which had been just another place for him to impose his superiority, was now a field where his power seemed to wane in the face of someone else's determination. He slowly put the phone down, realizing that if he called for backup and the situation got out of hand, it could turn into a scandal he didn't want. The policeman once again looked around the room full of people who looked at him with disapproval and contempt, and realized that this time his strength was not enough to intimidate everyone. He gave Mia and her brothers one last baleful glance and, holding back the rage boiling inside, hissed, "You're gonna regret this. I'll find a way to put you all in your place." With these words, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind him an oppressive silence and a feeling that justice, however small and uncertain, had found its place in this room after all. When the policeman finally left, slamming the door so that the glass panels shook, tension in the room seemed to recede, but not completely. Everyone in the restaurant felt the weight of what had just happened. Mia was still standing next to her brothers and Mr. Brown, trying to comprehend that it was over at least for this evening. But in the back of her mind, she realized that this nightmare had only just begun. Her heart ached, and old, painful memories that she had tried to forget for years came back to her mind. The tears still rolling down her cheeks involuntarily brought to mind scenes from her childhood, when her family had first moved to this city. Her parents, simple, hardworking people, had always dreamed of their children having better opportunities than they had. They believed that there would be a place in this city for everyone who was willing to work and try, but the reality turned out to be different. She remembered being stopped once in elementary school by a group of girls, white-skinned, well-groomed, and confident. Mia, who had been very young at the time, frowned in place, eyes wide with surprise and fear. The girls began to tease her, calling her foreign, dirty, apt, unfit for their school. One of them, the most insolent, ripped off her new hairband that her mother had given her. It was a small bandage, very simple, but to Mia it was something special, a symbol of her mother's love and care. When she came home in tears, her mother hugged her, wiping away her tears and whispering words of comfort. Mia remembered her mother saying, "You have to be strong, my girl. This world isn't always kind to us, but you have to rise above it. Show that you are better than." Those words stayed with her all the years she grew up, but each new encounter with injustice and hatred left a mark on her heart, turning the childhood wound into a deep scar. But she wasn't the only one facing it. Her brothers, Louis and Jaden, have also been targets of hatred and aggression since they were children. Louis, the oldest of the two, had always tried to protect his younger ones, especially Mia. But because of this, he himself was often the one who got hit. In middle school, he got into a fight with boys who mocked their family, calling them dirty outsiders, people who don't belong here. For this fight, Louis was reprimanded and punished, while his abusers were left without consequences. This was his first lesson in how the system works in this city. After that incident, Louis tried not to show his emotions anymore, to hide his pain and resentment under a mask of indifference. He was used to silently entering and moving forward, knowing that if he gave into hatred and anger, he would only make things worse for himself and his family. But this mask did not save him from loneliness and alienation. He grew up holding back his pain and anger, and that anger built up like poison, poisoning him from the inside out. Jaden, the youngest brother, was too young when they encountered the first signs of racism and injustice. He did not understand why their family was insulted, why they were looked upon with contempt. Mia recalled how he came home one day with tears in his eyes, asking, "Why do people dislike us so much? What have we done?" No one in the family had an answer to that question because they realized the problem was not them, but the prejudice and hatred that had taken root in society. Mia then tried to calm her brother down, saying that it was just a misunderstanding, that things would change when he grew up. But over the years, she realized that their childhood hope for change was a lie they themselves wanted to believe. Now, standing next to her brothers in the restaurant, she felt the weight of those wounds. Again, she knew that for them this encounter with the policeman was not just another episode of humiliation, it was the culmination of everything they had endured since childhood. Every insult, every taunt, every humiliation had built up inside. And now that they were facing the system that had shown them their place again, those wounds had reopened, causing even more acute pain. Mr. Brown, who was still standing nearby, looked intently at Mia and her brothers. He seemed to feel the pain that permeated their souls. He, too, knew what it meant to be humiliated and rejected, just as they did. His eyes expressed compassion and understanding. And seeing this, Mia felt a faint sense of comfort, as if someone finally shared her pain. "It must be hard for you," he said quietly, addressing all three of them. "I've seen men like that policeman many times. I've seen them ruin the lives of people who just want to be honest and decent. I understand how difficult this is for you, but know that your struggle is not in vain. You are stronger than they can imagine." Mr. Brown's words were like a balm to the wound. Mia felt a small spark of hope in her soul, but she knew there were more challenges ahead, that this policeman would not give up so easily, that his threats were serious. She felt fear for her brothers, for her family, realizing that their lives would never be the same. That night, leaving the restaurant with her brothers, she felt that in a world full of injustice and hatred, they were alone against everyone. But with that realization, a new feeling was born in her heart, a determination to fight. After the restaurant had emptied and the streets had fallen silent for the night, Mia and her brothers walked home. No one spoke a word, but there was tension in the air, as if every movement and sound could break their fragile inner peace. Mia felt exhausted. Encounter with the policeman, his angry and demeaning words, the cruel stare directed at her, seemed to tear her from the inside out, leaving only a feeling of emptiness and pain. She had hoped her brothers would forget about it, leave her alone, but she realized from their tense faces that they were not going to be silent. Louis and Jane walked side by side, not hiding their emotions. Louis's face was determined and angry, and he could barely contain it. His eyes glittered with cold determination, as if he'd made a vow to himself to avenge his sister. In his heart he was seething, his shoulders slumped, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't forget the humiliation Mia had suffered, Everything inside him demanded justice, and the thought of the cop going unpunished tore at him. Jaden, though younger, couldn't shake what had happened. His youthful idealism and belief in justice had collided with harsh reality for the first time. He looked at Lewis, a pleading look in his eyes. He wanted his older brother to do something, to prove that they could stand up for themselves and their sister. Jaden had grown up thinking of Lewis as his hero, and now it hurt him to see the injustice. They'd always run away from blatantly creep into their lives. When they reached their home, Mia turned to them, trying to reassure them, but her voice sounded as uncertain as her inner feelings. "Please, just forget about it," she whispered. "I can handle it like I always have. That man wasn't worth the risk we took for him. All he wanted was to see us humiliated. Let's not give him that power." But Lewis looked at her, and his gaze was hard. "Mia, we can't just let this go." "What? You think he's just gonna walk away and forget? He'll come back. He'll use his power again, try to put us in our place like we're nothing. If we keep quiet, it'll only give him more power." Mia felt her heart sink with fear for her brothers. She knew Lewis was right, knew that her words of calm and patience sounded false, but she couldn't let her brothers get involved, not after all they'd been through, not after what they'd already endured. She shuddered at the mere thought that a policeman might hurt them or use his power to ruin their future. "Please, Lewis," she begged again, grasping his hand. "I don't want you to risk it for me. Just let me forget it. I don't want it to go on. We can't beat him. You know what he can do to our family." But Lewis had already made his decision. His voice was cold but determined when he answered, "Mia, I'm not gonna let him touch you again. We've spent our whole lives being humiliated, hiding and hoping it all in. We're used to being patient, silent, afraid. But if we do nothing, if we let him bully us again, it won't end. He will know that he can bully us anyway here once, and no one will stand up for us." Jaden nodded, and his voice was firm as well. "Lewis is right. We can't keep quiet. Today he humiliated you. Tomorrow he'll do something else. If we don't fight back now, it won't stop." Mia realized that they would not back down. She saw that they were willing to do anything to defend her honor and protect her from further humiliation. Her brothers looked at her with such confidence and determination that her heart filled with fear and gratitude at the same time. She knew that for them this was more than a matter of honor. It was a fight for the right to be who they were, a fight for freedom from constant fear. At night, when everyone had gone to bed, Lewis and Jaden had a long discussion about what to do. They realized that an open confrontation with the policeman could have dire consequences for their entire family. They could turn to the local community, seek help from those who supported them. But Lewis knew that most of them would be afraid to stand up to the policeman. They realized that the policeman could use his position to slander them or fabricate charges against them. Lewis felt a sense of hopelessness inside. They could go to no one for help. Oh, this only confirmed his conviction that the only way to protect his family was to stand up for them himself. Lewis and Jaden held hands and swore to each other that they would never let anyone else humiliate their sister. This night had been a kind of initiation for them. It was a vow made in the dark, a vow they intended to fulfill at all costs. The next morning, Mia found a note from Lewis and Jaden, writing that they had gone to take care of business and that she shouldn't worry. But Mia felt anxious. She knew that the brothers had decided to take a risk for her, and she was gripped with fear that it could end badly. Lewis's words from last night echoed in her head. If we don't fight back now, he won't stop. On this day, her brothers went to meet some friends who, just like them, were not ready to be silent and tolerate injustice. The meeting was held in one of the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town, where no one could see or hear them. They were people who, like Mia, had suffered a lifetime of injustice and racial hatred. They decided it was time to unite to show that they would not be silenced. When Lewis spoke to them, his voice was full of passion and anger built up over years of patience and humiliation. We have to show that we will not be intimidated. We all know this cop isn't the only one. They all feel superior to us, think they can treat us like we're nothing. But we have to show them that we have strength, that we have pride. We have to show that we are not afraid. Mia, who remained at home, spent the day tense, anxiously awaiting her brother's return. She realized that they might have started more than just that of confronting a single policeman. It was a fight for dignity and freedom, a fight in which each of them had much to lose. By evening, Louis and Jaden had returned home. They were exhausted, but the fire of determination burned in their eyes. Mia realized that they wouldn't back down now. Their silence was over, and even if it got them into trouble, even if they had to fight alone, they would stand to the end. Mia went to work the next day with an oppressive sense of unease. She didn't know what her brothers would do, but there was something frightening in their eyes last night, a mixture of determination and pain she'd never seen before. Mia realized that her brothers wouldn't stop, even if it cost them peace, and that fear had haunted her since this morning. Her mind was weighed down by the thought that Louis and Jane would do anything to protect her, even if it meant confronting the cop himself. A little later that morning, the doors of the restaurant opened and the very same policeman entered the room. His figure seemed to fill the entire room, creating a sense of heaviness and fear that hung in the air like a thick fog. A smug grin shone on his face, and he immediately fixed his gaze on Mia. There was the same cruel glint in his eyes as last time, a glint of superiority and a willingness to crush her again with his words and glances. She felt her body tense at his mere presence. Memories of her recent humiliation flashed through her mind, reawakening feelings of shame and fear. But now there was a spark of anger in her soul along with it, an anger that she knew was fueled by her brothers' determination not to leave her alone. The policeman paid no attention to the other visitors and went straight to her desk. His gait was slow and confident, like a man who knew he could face no consequences. He didn't just want to remind her of his authority, he wanted to show everyone present that she belonged to him, that she could be nothing but obedient and submissive in his presence. So, back on the job again. His voice sounded with a mocking intonation, spreading across the hall. I guess you didn't come to any conclusions after our conversation after all. Mia tried to hold herself together, trying not to give away her anxiety. She knew that her brothers could come at any moment, and that it could have consequences she couldn't foresee. She glanced at the policeman, trying to keep a calm expression on her face, but her voice still shook when she answered, I'm just doing my job. Please don't do that again. He grinned, as if her answer only added to his pleasure. His smile grew wider, but it was nothing but cold, dismissive gloating. Look, you have to understand one simple thing, he said with frank contempt. In this town, it's all about who you are and what you are. And you're nothing. Your work, your effort, it's all for nothing. And the sooner you realize that, the better for you. Those words were the last straw. Mia felt the anger rising inside her like a hot wave, consuming her fear and shame. She couldn't stay silent any longer, couldn't take it any longer. She stepped forward, gathering all her resolve, and spoke firmly. Oh, her voice shook. You have no right to talk to me like that. No one should have to endure that kind of humiliation. You're no better than me just because of your badge. There was dead silence in the room. The restaurant patrons, who had previously avoided looking at what was happening, could not take their eyes off her. The policeman was clearly stunned that she had dared to fight back. The policeman was clearly stunned that she had dared to fight back. He stepped forward, so close that Mia could smell the cold scent of his cologne and see his eyes flash with anger. Don't you get it, girl? His voice was quiet, but full of anger. You have no right to talk to me like that. I could make your life even more miserable if I wanted to. You better shut up and go back to your seat. At that moment, the restaurant door opened again, and Louis and Jaden appeared. They saw what was happening, and they moved forward without hesitation. Their faces were contorted with anger and determination, and there was no fear in their gait. They had come to put an end to their sister's humiliation and suffering, even if it cost them dearly. The policeman, seeing them approaching, grinned and turned toward them, squinting contemptuously. Here are your knights in shining armor, he said with a sneer. How nice of you all to be here. Do you think the three of you can make a difference? Louis stepped forward, his gaze hard and serious. He held himself straight and confident, not letting the policeman see the slightest fear. We won't let you humiliate our sister anymore. Enough. His voice sounded clear and confident, like a man who would give anything to protect his loved ones. The policeman, seeing that Louis was not going to back down, grinned even wider and took out his cell phone again. This time he dialed the number faster than he had the last time. Without taking his eyes off Louis, he spoke into the receiver. "I need backup. There's a problem here with violent troublemakers." Tension hung in the hall. The restaurant patrons did not take their eyes off what was happening, realizing that the situation was escalating and that this confrontation could turn tragic. Mia, seeing that her brothers were in danger, felt a wave of panic run through her body. "Louis, Jaden, please don't." She tried to stop them, her voice full of pleading. "Let's go, please. He's provoking us on purpose." But Louis did not back down. He was resolute, and his eyes burned with unyielding determination. "No, Mia," he answered firmly, not taking his eyes off the policeman. "We've been silent for too long. He needs to know he can't intimidate us anymore." The policeman, seeing that reinforcements were on their way, stood with a smug grin, clearly enjoying the way the brothers were trapping themselves with every word. He knew that any attempt at resistance would only make their situation worse, and this confidence in his power added to his confidence. "You regret this," he said with icy certainty, aiming the words straight at Louis's face. "I'll give you a life that will make you wish you could go back to the way it was. Think about whether you want to keep resisting." Louis and Jaden did not back down. At this point, they already knew that their choice to stay here and stand until the end would not change. They knew that there would be serious consequences, but they also realized that giving in now would mean eternal submission and humiliation. When the sirens sounded outside, Mia felt her heart clench with terror. She knew her brothers wouldn't back down, but she also realized that their confrontation with this policeman, a man who saw them as nothing more than targets for his arrogance and hatred, was now much more than a personal conflict. It was the beginning of a fight for respect and dignity, for the right to be herself, for the right to live without fear of injustice. And while Mia knew that the journey would be difficult, she also realized that for the first time in a long time, her family was finally fighting back without hiding behind the shadow of fear. As the sirens approached, Mia felt her anxiety turn to fear, almost paralyzing her. Her brothers stood in front of the policeman with an expression of determination, but deep down, she knew they were afraid too. They realized that this man standing in front of them was not just an officer, but part of a system that had always targeted people like them. In that system, their lives and dignity meant next to nothing, and one wrong move could cost them too much. The sirens subsided, and several police cars stopped at the entrance to the restaurant. Drivers and passers-by watched with bated breath. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was unbearably tense, and everyone present, without saying a word, felt fear for what might happen to Mia and her brothers. The doors of the restaurant opened, and several officers entered. Their expressions were stern, cold, and seemingly devoid of any compassion. They did not inquire into the situation. They knew that their colleague had called them and that he would determine who was right and who was guilty. One of the officers immediately approached the policeman who had threatened Mia and her brothers a few minutes ago and asked, "What's the problem? What happened here?" The policeman turned to his colleagues with a smug smile, pointing to Louis and Jaden. "These people are disruptive," he said confidently, not hiding his gloating. "They're threatening me and other visitors. I think they should be arrested, so they can learn their lesson." Mia felt her legs give out. Those words sounded like a death sentence for her brothers. She knew that once they were handcuffed, their fate would be sealed. In a small town with prejudice and racial discrimination, even one arrest could leave a stain on a lifetime. Their chances of getting justice in court were slim to none, and the system would surely side with the cop who had managed to make his victims look guilty. Louis clenched his fists, his face contorted with rage, but he knew that any sudden movement he made could be interpreted as aggression, which would only aggravate their situation. He realized that this policeman had deliberately provoked them to use this as an excuse to arrest them, but Louis wasn't going to keep quiet. "We were just protecting our sister," he said firmly, looking into the officer's eyes. "This man insulted her and threatened her. He uses his power to humiliate people. We will not allow this to continue." The policeman threw a hate-filled look at Louis and immediately intervened. "You don't call the shots here, kid. I said you were out of order, and that's what you are. You and your brother resisted off-duty officers, and I strongly suggest you think twice before you cross me." We can make your life a lot harder." The officers beside him stood silently, expressing no doubt about their colleagues' words. They looked at Mia and her brothers with cold detachment, as if they were criminals. And that indifference was the worst thing for Mia. She felt that their lives, their feelings, and even their fear didn't matter to these men in uniform. Mia stepped forward, her voice trailing off as she turned to the officers. "Please, he was humiliating me and my brothers were just trying to protect me. We didn't do anything. We didn't threaten anyone. We just want him to leave us alone." The policeman looked at her with contempt, and his voice came through louder than before, for everyone in the room to hear. "You're all nothing here. Did you think you could disrupt order? That you were allowed to speak against us?" His voice sounded menacing, threatening, and it was directed not only at Mia and her brothers, but at anyone who dared to take their side. Louis couldn't take it anymore. All the wounds he and his family had suffered over the years came rushing back into his soul. He realized that if he backed down now, they would always live in fear and humiliation, that they would never be given the chance to be equal among the rest. He stepped closer, feeling every muscle in his body tense, his heart beating with such force that it rumbled in his ears. "Do you want us to shut up?" he said, looking straight into the policeman's eyes. "You want us to just bear it, but that's not going to happen. You can arrest us. You can threaten us. You can do whatever you want, but we won't be afraid anymore." These words caused silent confusion among the police officers. It was hard for them to understand how a man facing a threat could confront them so confidently. Their gazes, however, remained cold. To them, this confrontation was simply a matter of strength and submission, and none of them was going to yield. The policeman, infuriated by Louis's answer, approached him sharply, his face crimson with rage. "You've made a big mistake, boy," he said, his voice full of hate. "You think anyone will come to your aid? No one here will take your side. Everybody knows who's in charge." With these words, he signaled to his colleagues. Two officers immediately approached Louis, and Jaden grabbed their hands and began handcuffing them. Mia tried to intervene, her scream breaking the silence. "No, please don't. They didn't do anything." But her words went unanswered. Louis and Jaden were grabbed roughly, and she saw their faces contorted with pain and resentment. They knew they were powerless against this system, that no amount of determination or words could change their situation. This policeman had left them no choice. He had not given them even the slightest chance of justice. As they were led out of the restaurant, the people around them were silent. Some looked sympathetic, others wary, afraid to intervene, but no one dared to take their side. Mia, feeling utterly helpless, ran after her brothers, screaming and begging the officers to stop, to let them go, but they kept going, ignoring her. The policeman, as he passed her, stopped for a moment, looked at her with an expression of utter contempt, and said coldly, "This is a lesson to you, your brothers and anyone else who thinks it's okay to mess around here. Never forget who is the authority here." With those words, he turned away and walked on, leaving Mia standing alone, humiliated and broken, in the street. Her brothers were shoved into the car, and she heard the sirens howl again, carrying them away from her. She felt her heart breaking with pain and despair. When the cars turned the corner, Mia was alone, all alone, in the middle of a deserted street. Tears sprang from her eyes, and she sank to her knees without strength, feeling that her whole life, all her hopes, had been shattered in an instant. Her brothers, her only protection and support, were now far away, taken away by a cruel man to whom they had done nothing wrong. She knew that their future was now in jeopardy, that their lives were being ordered by people who had no compassion for them. As the police cars with Louis and Jaden drove away, Mia stood on the street, staring at her brothers as they drove away. Her heart, torn to pieces, gave her no rest, and she didn't know what to do next. She had lost everything she held dear at this moment. Her family was destroyed, and she was alone in the face of a system that deemed her existence of little value. Her loneliness seemed complete, insurmountable. But as Mia stood there, utterly crushed, several restaurant patrons came outside and approached her. Among them was Mr. Brown, the same man who had tried to stand up for her the day before. He approached Mia, put his hand on her shoulder, and said quietly, We've seen everything that's happened, and we know it's not fair. It can't stay that way. No, one should have to put up with this." Mia struggled to look up at him. Her face was wet with tears, and hopelessness shone in her eyes. She was amazed that someone dared to speak out loud about this, taking her side when it already seemed impossible. She hadn't expected these people to be supportive, knowing that fear of the police usually made people keep such cases quiet. But Mr. Brown went on, his voice sounding firm and confident. "I have lived in this city all my life, and I have seen a lot of injustice. I know how hard it is for those who were born in the wrong place and the wrong color. But these things can't go unpunished. I've seen your brothers defend you, and I'm not going to let that go unnoticed." Mia felt her heart freeze, then start beating with renewed vigor. She wasn't alone. Her brothers had just been taken away, and she felt like she was losing everything. But now there were people standing in front of her who shared her pain. They couldn't bring her brothers back right now, but their presence, their words, seemed to give her a new chance at hope. One of the other guests, a young man named Carter, approached her and said with bitterness in his voice, "I saw the way that cop acted with you. It wasn't the first time. He's been doing it for a long time, and people have been tolerating it for a long time. He humiliated others, abused his power, but every time, everyone kept quiet because they were afraid of the repercussions. No, it's hard, but maybe it's time for him to answer for what he's done." These words began to gather others around Mia and Mr. Brown. With each word spoken, a sense of community and support grew, and it filled Mia with hope. People realized that her brothers had done nothing wrong. They had protected their sister, defended their honor, and now they couldn't let their actions be misinterpreted and used against them. One of the women who had previously stood aside said quietly, "I remember how this policeman threatened my son a few months ago. My boy was not guilty of anything. He was just walking down the street, and this man stopped him, started interrogating him, accusing him for no reason. But I did not dare to go against him then, because I was afraid for my son. Now I realize that by our silence we only gave him more power." The woman's words penetrated Mia's soul. She realized that she was not alone in facing injustice and humiliation. Here, all around her, there were people who, like her, had experienced fear and helplessness, who had faced the cruelty of the system, but now they no longer wanted to be silent. Mr. Brown looked at everyone present and offered something they didn't expect. "We have to make this case heard. Let the city know the truth. Let everyone know that this man is abusing his power, that he is not a defender of the law, but a threat to people. We need to contact local newspapers, journalists who can tell this story." The words alarmed some, but others nodded in agreement. It was a bold move that could have unpleasant consequences for all of them, but there was determination in the eyes of Mr. Brown and the others. They were tired of being silent, tired of hiding in fear of a power that protected only itself. One of the visitors, a young man, pulled out his cell phone and offered to film the testimonies of those who had witnessed what had happened. He asked Mia if she would like to tell her story so that the whole town could hear her voice. Mia was hesitant at first, fearful. What would people think? How would it affect her family? But then she realized that if she didn't do it now, all their struggle would be for nothing. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength, and looked directly into the camera and began to speak. "My name is Mia. Today my brothers, Louis and Jaden, were arrested for trying to protect me from injustice. These police officers insulted me, humiliated me, threatened my family, and my brothers couldn't just watch it. They tried to stand up for me because they knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore." With each word, her voice grew stronger, and now she spoke not only for herself, but for all those who had been humiliated, who felt deprived of their right to justice. "I know we are not the only ones who have been hurt by this man. He uses his power to intimidate people, to humiliate them, but I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want people to know the truth. I want everyone to realize that my brothers did nothing wrong. They just couldn't keep quiet." After her speech, people started talking, sharing their stories. They told about their fears, how the police had abused their power, how they had been threatened and humiliated. These words were full of pain and tragedy, but at the same time, they carried the light of hope. This small group of people gathered in front of the restaurant felt that perhaps it was time for a change, that they could fight together for justice. for the right to be heard, for the right to live without fear. As Mia listened to them, she felt her soul fill with new strength. She realized that the struggle of her brothers and her family would no longer be a solitary one. The videos shot on the phone began to spread on social media. People in the city, in other neighborhoods, and even in neighboring cities saw it, and a wave of support began to grow. Those who knew what it was like to live in fear, those who had faced injustice, those who were afraid but now had the courage to speak out, began to unite. The story of Mia and her brothers became not only their personal tragedy, but also a symbol of their struggle against a system that always seemed invincible. The day after Lewis and Jaden were arrested, a video with Mia's words and testimonies from other residents went viral and became a social media sensation. The publicity spread like wildfire, and soon the story of Mia and her brothers reached the local news. What started as a personal tragedy turned into a social movement demanding justice and accountability from the authorities. Mia was both shocked and frightened by this reaction. She wanted the injustice to be heard, but did not expect that her pain would become the business of an entire city. Now her story resonated with many people who, like her, felt disempowered and faced aggression and humiliation because of prejudice and discrimination. But along with the support came new threats. The policemen, whose arbitrariness they were trying to expose was not just a loner, but part of a system that covered and protected him. Over the years, he had become an influential figure with ties to local officials in the leadership of the police department. He was well aware that open warfare had begun against him, and he was ready to use all his connections and resources to quell the rebellion against his authority. A few days after the story began to gain momentum, several police cars showed up outside Mia's house. Mia, noticing the flashers through the window, grew cold with fear. She realized it was a warning, an attempt to scare her and silence her. These people wanted to show that she and her brothers had made a huge mistake by fighting the system. As she stepped out onto the porch, one of the policemen, looking at her emotionlessly, said coldly, "You better stop. Mia, you and your brothers have already caused enough trouble. I'm sure you don't want you and your family to suffer the consequences." These words, spoken quietly and calmly, sounded like direct threats. They made her realize that her life and the lives of her loved ones were in danger if she did not stop spreading information and seeking support. She felt fear engulf her again, but along with that fear, something new was growing in her soul: rage and determination. Her life was already ruined. As it was, her brothers had been taken away and accused of crimes they didn't commit. She realized that this was her only chance, the chance she had to use to save them and bring justice. Events began to unfold more and more rapidly. Local journalists, having heard about the abuse cases, started digging deeper into the police officers' past. Other incidents, hushed up complaints and covered up cases in which he had been involved came to light. People who had previously been afraid to speak out began to give anonymous testimony about how this man and his colleagues used their power to humiliate, arrest on spurious charges, and threaten to intimidate those who tried to resist. Mia couldn't believe that her story had helped bring so many other tragedies to light. She realized that her brothers weren't the only ones who had been hurt by this cop. He had a long history of brutality and impunity that he hid behind his badge, and now, thanks to her and the support of others, that darkness was beginning to dissipate, revealing the true face of a man who thought he was untouchable. But with each new revelation, the pressure on Mia and her family increased. First, she began receiving anonymous threatening phone calls. Some called in the middle of the night without saying a word, just leaving a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Another time she received a letter warning her that some people must stay where they are or they may regret it. These threats were scary and real, but they only strengthened her resolve. She knew that now she had no turning back. This struggle culminated in a large rally organized by the town residents. Hundreds of people gathered in the main square, demanding justice for Lewis and Jaden and a fair investigation into the police officers' actions. They held placards that read, "Justice for all. Say no to racism. Freedom for Lewis and Jaden." Mia was struck by this unity. She stood in the crowd, surrounded by the support and sympathy of the people who had come to fight for the truth with her. Her heart pounded with joy and pride for all these people who, despite their fear, had dared to speak out. But at the same time, she knew that their support could have turned tragic. She knew that the policeman and his entourage would not back down, and that realization never left her for a second. Indeed, a backlash ensued the next day. The police department issued a statement accusing Lewis and Jaden of assaulting officers and endangering public safety. They portrayed Mia's brothers as trespassers, as the people who allegedly committed the crime. The statement emphasized the police were prepared to protect the order and safety of the city by any means necessary, insinuating that the actions of Mia and her followers were only provoking unnecessary unrest. These words caused Mia to feel bitter despair. She realized that the system they were facing was ready for any manipulation and lies to justify its actions and destroy her brothers. Mia saw that now their struggle had reached a new level. It was a battle against lies and cruelty, disguised as public good. Even so, people continued to take to the streets demanding the truth. Journalists, inspired by this story, continued to publish stories about police abuses. The story of Mia and her family became a symbol of the struggle for justice, and now even people from other cities began to support them. A few weeks later, when the pressure on the authorities was at its peak, the city government was forced to announce an investigation into the police officers' actions. The move was the first ray of hope for Mia, but she realized that there were many more months of struggle ahead of them. She knew that her brothers would have to endure many more hardships. Yes, their lives were forever changed, but now she had support, and she was not alone. That day, when the investigation was announced, was a small victory, a symbol that even the darkest secrets could be exposed. Mia felt that her life, her struggle and her pain had not been in vain. When the city authorities announced the opening of an investigation into the police officers' actions, Mia had mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was confirmation that her struggle had borne fruit, that the voices of the people who had supported her and her brothers were finally being heard. But joy was quickly replaced by anxiety. She realized that this step only increased the pressure on her and her family. Now she and her brothers found themselves not only at the center of a city scandal, but also in the line of fire of a system that resisted the truth by protecting its representatives. A few days after the investigation was announced, Mia noticed that she and her house were being watched. In the beginning, it was strange shadows flickering in the twilight near her windows. Late at night, it was cars with tinted windows driving past their house slowly, as if the drivers wanted to make sure she could see their presence. Mia was beginning to dread leaving the house, but realized there was no turning back. If she stopped now, it would not only ruin her brothers, but it would betray the people who had dared to support her despite the threats. Her fear for her brothers grew stronger with each passing day. Lewis and Jaden remained in custody, and although lawyers were allowed to visit them, every time a lawyer visited them, he informed Mia of more trumped-up charges that the police were trying to pin on them. Lewis and Jaden were charged not only with resisting authorities and assaulting officers, but also with organizing a public disturbance and even attempting to incite violence. These charges sounded absurd, but they were serious threats, and each new count added to their case made release less and less likely. Mia began to notice that their fight had turned into something more than just an attempt to protect her family. It had now become a war for the truth, and there were no longer any safe places in this war. Every day she and those who supported her faced the consequences of their choices. People who used to come to rallies and openly oppose police actions now increasingly found their jobs threatened. Their neighbors began to look at them with judgment and even fear. Some were threatened, others were told to mind their own business. But for many, this only strengthened their resolve to fight to the end. One day, as Mia was walking down the street, someone approached her and handed her a note. The paper she was handed said, "If you don't want to lose your brothers forever, stop before it's too late." Those words felt like they cut her apart. She felt a shiver come over her, and she had to sit down on the bench to keep from falling. Everything around her spun. For the first time since this fight began, despair gripped her. She realized that her enemies weren't just threatening her, they were willing to do anything to silence her. In desperation, Mia decided she needed to see her brothers. Despite the difficulties and risks, she went to a lawyer, begging to arrange a meeting with him. After days of waiting and hurdles, she was finally allowed to see Louis and Jaden. When she entered the small, cold visitation room at the prison, her heart snapped in pain at the sight of their emaciated faces. Louis and Jaden, her brothers, her strength and support, looked depressed and tired. Their gazes dulled. "Mia, you have to stop." Louis was the first to speak, his voice weak, but it still sounded concerned for her. "These people, they won't stop. We knew what could happen when we decided to go against them, but you shouldn't risk yourself." Mia felt tears come to her eyes. She couldn't believe that Louis, her older brother, who had always been the epitome of strength, was now broken and asking her to stop. She held out her arms to him, desperately trying to support him, but even her words seemed insignificant compared to the horror they were all experiencing. "Louis, Jaden, you're not alone. People support us. They know the truth," she said, barely containing the tremor in her voice. "I can't stop now. We can't let them take our lives." Jaden, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, his voice full of pain. "Mia, we see what these people are. They're willing to destroy us to keep their power. They'll do anything to keep us quiet. And if you don't stop, they will do something terrible." Those words left a deep mark in Mia's heart. She knew they were right, knew that the system they were fighting was ready to crush any attempt at resistance. But she also knew that stopping now would mean betraying all those who believed in her, all those who had risked for the truth. She knew that if her brothers remained in prison, their lives would be forever crippled. When her time with her brothers came to an end, Mia promised them that she would not give up, that she would fight for their freedom despite all the threats and dangers. She felt that in that moment their bond became even stronger, that their love and faith in each other became her only source of strength. As she left the prison, Mia realized that she had a long and difficult road ahead of her. She couldn't predict how it would end, but she knew she could never go back to her old life. Her brothers were in prison and her home was under constant surveillance, but she wouldn't let herself break. That evening, she spoke in front of the camera again, recording an appeal to everyone who had been following their story. "They want us to be silent. They threaten us, my brothers and all those who dare to support us. But we can't let them shut us up. My brother Louis and Jaden are innocent. All they did was try to protect me, and now they sit behind bars because the truth has become a threat to those who abuse their power." Tears rolled down her face, but her voice remained firm, and people who looked at her could feel that she would not give up. Her pain embodied the suffering of an entire community, tired of fear and humiliation, of constant aggression and discrimination. She knew that her struggle would become an example for others, that her story would inspire others to resist. The video quickly spread, and people all over the city took to the streets again. People from neighboring towns and even other states joined them. This movement became more than a personal tragedy for Mia and her brothers. It became a symbol of the struggle for equality, for the right to be heard and to live without fear of injustice. Over the following weeks, a wave of protests and rallies hit the city. The story of Mia, Louis, and Jaden inspired thousands of people to take to the streets to demand justice. More and more residents of the city and neighboring counties began to raise their voices against police abuse, telling their stories, sharing their pain and experiences. People who were once afraid to say a word against authority now felt that they were not alone, that they had support. Under such pressure, the city authorities could no longer pretend that the problem did not exist. The media, attracted by the resonance of the story, began to intervene more and more actively. Journalists began to dig deeper, revealing the dark sides of not only this policeman's activities, but also the entire local government structure. Gradually, new facts began to emerge, complaints that did not reach the court, incidents with these police officers that were hushed up or erased from the reports. Cases came to light where the police officers had abused his power by threatening families, humiliating and intimidating people, especially those who could not defend themselves. It became increasingly clear that his actions were not just random antics. They had become the norm, covered up and protected by higher authorities. Under public pressure, city officials announced the suspension of the police officers pending investigation, but this was only a small victory, a temporary concession to stem the tide of popular anger. Nevertheless, for Mia and her family, it was a small step toward justice. At They felt that their struggle had not been in vain. However, even after his suspension, the policeman was not about to give up his position. He still had connections and influence, and he was determined to protect his reputation and position. Now his goal was to destroy the reputation of Mia and her family. He began spreading rumors that Mia's brothers were criminals who had repeatedly broken the law, and that the whole movement was simply an attempt to divert attention from their real crimes. Some TV channels that supported the government and the police department began airing programs denigrating Mia's family, portraying them as dangerous radicals and even insiders of violence. These false accusations only added to Mia's suffering. Her family, already exhausted by constant fear and pressure, now had to face hatred from people who believed the rumors. Some of the neighbors who used to support her began to avoid her gaze, fearing that supporting a family that had come under the scrutiny of the police would bring them trouble. Mia felt isolated again, felt cornered again, in this world where the truth was just another threat. One day, on her way home from a rally, Mia noticed that the door of her house was ajar. Alarmed, she stepped inside and found the house turned upside down. Drawers had been pulled out. Things were scattered across the floor as if someone had been carefully searching for something. She was sure this was no ordinary burglary. Someone was trying to intimidate her, to let her know that even in her own home she wouldn't be safe. This intrusion had been the final straw. She realized that her enemies had overstepped their bounds and were now willing to destroy everything she held dear to keep her quiet. The next day, Mia went to the press and made a statement about the break-in at her home and the new threats she faced. Her words sparked another wave of public outrage. People saw that the authorities were trying to crush her and her family, and this made them even more determined to support her. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, and finally the policeman was summoned to court to testify. The courtroom was packed not only with his colleagues and superiors, but also with many citizens who wanted to see justice done. It was one of the most stressful days of Mia's life. She knew that the policeman would try to deny all the charges, to make her and her brothers look like liars, to portray themselves as victims of circumstance. When the interrogation began, the policeman coldly denied all the accusations. He claimed that he was just doing his job and that Mia and her brothers were allegedly trying to provoke him to use it against him. His words were confident and his manner was defiant. He knew he still had supporters, that the system, despite the temporary concessions, was still behind him. But fortunately, several witnesses who had previously been afraid to testify dared to come forward. People who had once remained silent now raised their voices and recounted instances in which the police officers had abused, humiliated, and intimidated them. They did not hide their fear, but realized that their silence gave this man the freedom to do evil. Their stories were full of pain and tragedy, and each witness strengthened the position of Mia and her brothers. The climax came when a former police officer who had once worked with the policeman dared to speak out. He revealed that he had witnessed numerous abuses by his former colleague, but was afraid that speaking out against him would lead to job loss and even threats. Now, seeing how people stood up for Mia and her brothers, he could no longer remain silent. His words were a heavy blow to the police officer's defense. After several long weeks of court proceedings, the policeman was found guilty of abuse of power and threats. This decision was the first of its kind in the city. The police officers, who had recently felt untouchable, was now forced to leave his post and forfeited all the privileges that the system had provided him. But even so, Mia couldn't feel completely satisfied. Her brothers were still in prison, and their charges had not yet been dropped. Now Mia had to start a new fight for their freedom, for justice for them. But she knew that she had support now, that those who believed in her and the truth were there for her. That day was a turning point for the entire city. People saw that even the most powerful and rigid system can be defeated if you fight together, if you don't back down in the face of threats. Mia realized that this fight had changed her life forever, that she would never go back to the quiet, humble life she had had. Now her life was dedicated to truth and justice, not just for her family, but for all those who had ever suffered injustice and hatred. The trial of the policeman was over, and now the city breathed a sigh of relief, feeling that some change had finally taken place. People who had been silent for years about injustice and abuse saw that their voices had power. It was as if the whole city had been transformed, feeling that truth and justice were no longer just words, that even the most powerful fear could be defeated by coming together. But for Mia, the struggle was not over. Although the police officers was suspended and convicted, her brothers, Louis and Jaden, remained behind bars, accused of crimes they did not commit. All the struggle, all the pain and sacrifices they had made were in vain while her family was still threatened. Every day, Mia continued to fight, going to meetings with lawyers, holding rallies and socializing with people who supported her. Her face became a symbol of the justice movement in the city, but the more she did, the harder the system worked to keep Louis and Jaden behind bars. Their case became not only a trial, but also a way to intimidate those who dared to speak the truth. As time went on, the situation became more and more difficult for Mia. She could feel herself burning out, the struggle draining her strength, but her love for her brothers would not let her give up. She knew that her life now belonged to this struggle, that she would not be able to live in peace until her family was freed. This struggle became her existence, her essence, and each new lie from the authorities, each new refusal to give her brothers a fair trial, made her resolve stronger and stronger. Once, when she was allowed a brief meeting with Louis and Jaden, she saw that they had changed. Their eyes were tired and bitter, their faces pale and haggard. The prison conditions were brutal, and every day behind bars took their strength and hope away. Even so, they had the courage not to break, not to give their enemies a chance to see their fear. "Mia," Louis said, his voice quiet but caring, "you have to live. We understand that you're doing the best you can, and we'll never forget that. But you have to remember to take care of yourself, to take care of yourself." Mia felt her heart bursting with pain again. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at her brothers, knowing that as long as they were here, she wouldn't be able to live her life in case. She promised herself she wouldn't give up, but deep down she felt fear that her strength was waning, that each new day was making her weaker and weaker. Her struggle attracted attention, but the authorities, realizing this, began to act more and more insidiously. They managed to charge Mia with attempted incitement and disturbing public order during one of the rallies she was organizing. Now the threat was hanging over her as well. They had managed to create false evidence, and now she was facing a trial that could result in a prison sentence. This news came as a shock to Mia, but she couldn't allow herself to be weak. Instead, she turned to those who supported her with even more determination. She knew that if they could break her, everything they had accomplished would be destroyed, and her brothers would remain in prison forever. She spoke again to the cells, addressing the people, and her words sounded like a manifesto. "We are silenced, we are humiliated, we are destroyed because we want the truth. Why, Brother Louis and Jaden are behind bars not because they broke the law, but because the system fears their truth, their courage. If we all stay silent, then who will be left to speak up? We all deserve a life without fear and humiliation. I am not afraid of their threats, and I will not stop." These words united people again. The rallies became even larger. The protests intensified, and more people began to speak out against the system. People from other cities began to come to support Mia and her family, and this wave of protest spread beyond their city, becoming a symbol of national resistance against racism and injustice. Finally, under public pressure, Louis and Jaden's case was referred to a higher court. The trial was long and painful, but Mia did not give up, supporting her brothers to the end. On a day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed with people who came to support her and her family. The trial was surprisingly fair, and all the false accusations and false police testimony were exposed. The judge, seeing the injustice Louis and Jaden faced, handed down an acquittal. Her brothers were released, and it was a moment that Mia had walked through pain, suffering, and humiliation. When Louis and Jaden walked free, they were greeted with applause and shouts of encouragement. Mia hugged them, feeling that their family was finally together again. But even after their release, Mia knew their struggle was not over. They had won one battle, but there was a long road ahead to full equality and justice. The city had changed because of their struggle, but the tragedy and suffering they had endured had left an indelible mark. This Struggle took a part of her life and left scars in her soul and heart, but it also gave her strength, faith in people and their ability to stand up to even the most brutal system. Mia, Louis, and Jaden were now symbols of this struggle, symbols of courage and resilience. They realized that this victory was only the beginning, but they were ready to keep going. Their family, wounded but unbroken, epitomized that even the darkest of times can be defeated by standing up for the truth. Mia and her family's story inspired many, and she knew that their example would live on in the hearts of people, becoming a testament that despite all the threats and suffering, everyone has the right to respect, to justice, and to a voice that cannot be silenced. Friends, after such an emotional and difficult story, we would like to know your opinion. Write in the comments what you think about what happened. Have you or your loved ones experienced injustice or racism in your life? Share your stories. Your voices are important, and we value each and every one of you. Every comment, every like, and your support is incredibly valuable to us. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories that raise important issues and help you fight for justice. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a great day and peace in your heart.